Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the very tragic case of Margaret Breem and the murder of Robert and Annie Breem, which took place in the Pandon area of Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1876. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Margaret Breem was born Margaret Hara in around 1843 in Newcastle to parents James and Anne, and she was one of at least 5 children. She married Robert Breem in December of 1866, and the couple had at least 2 children together. By 1876 she had been living apart from her husband for quite some time, but he still paid the rent for her home where she lived with the 2 children in Pandon. Margaret worked as a charlady. While it is never mentioned if she was a great drinker, it is said that her husband had left her as she did not keep their home clean and tidy, and that he could not live with her any longer. Robert himself was a big drinker and had spent some time in prison for drunkenness in 1876. He was living in Gateshead and working as a joiner, and it's not clear how much he actually saw of his children. Robert and Annie Breem, the victims, were the 2 young children of Margaret and Robert Senior, and they both lived with their mother in a room in Pandon in Newcastle. Their grandfather had lived with them for a time until he had moved out in early 1876. Annie was around 5 years old and Robert was around 8 years old at the time of their deaths. On the afternoon of April the 7th, 1876, Mrs. Scott was talking to Mrs. Shafto, who was a new tenant living in some rooms at Pandon Bank. It can only be assumed that she mentioned something about a bad smell coming from one of the other rooms, as whatever she said made Mrs. Scott attempt to enter the room in question. And this was the room that belonged to Margaret Breem, where she lived with her 2 young children. Mrs. Scott noticed that the keyhole to the room was blocked up with rags, and she had difficulty getting them out so that she could open the door. But once the door was open, she found the room to be in a terrible state. Lots of cobwebs on the ceiling and vermin on the floor, and a foul smell in the air. She did not go inside, but as she was about to leave, a lady by the name of Mrs. Sloane called up to her asking if that was Margaret's room. Mrs. Sloane came up and went inside with Mrs. Scott, and she noticed some white sheets on the bed, and on moving them the 2 women made the shocking discovery of the bodies of Robert and Annie Breem, who had clearly been dead for quite a long time. The women immediately went in search of the police to tell them what they had found, and P.C. Scott was the first to arrive at the house, and he immediately sent for Dr. Page to examine the bodies of the 2 young children, and he was told who their mother was, and he then went to search for her. And P.C. Scott found Margaret in Granger Street in Newcastle, and she asked him if he wanted her because of the children, and P.C. Scott said yes he did. Margaret did not say anything else after this, and she was charged on the suspicion of the murder of her 2 children and taken to the police station. The inquest was held at the Hole in the Wall Inn at Pandon Bank before Coroner Hoyle. Margaret Breem was said to be ill and was not present. It was not stated who had identified the bodies of Robert and Annie Breem, but it can only be assumed that it was Mrs. Scott, as at the beginning of the evidence she stated that the bodies shown to the jury were that of Robert and Annie, but she did not officially identify them at the inquest. Sarah Scott said she lived in the same house in the room above as Margaret and her children in Pandon. She said that 7 months ago she had spoken to Margaret, who said she was going to take Robert to North Shields to stay with her family. A month later she saw Margaret again, and she said she had taken him there and that he was doing well. Sarah said that Robert was disabled and was unable to walk, and perhaps she mentioned this as she thought that Margaret was not able to look after him on her own. Sarah then said a month after this she saw Margaret again, and this time she was told that Annie had also gone to stay with the family in North Shields. She said Margaret told her this was because Annie had been fretting for her brother. Sarah said after this she did not hear any children cry in the house again. Sarah continued, saying that until around 3 months ago, Margaret still came back and forward to the house in Pandon, coming in at night and going out again each morning. And she said she had seen her and asked how the children were doing, and Margaret had told her they were doing nicely and that she visited them every other day, but that they upset her as they always cried when she had to leave, and she didn't like to leave them. She said that on April the 7th, Mrs. Shafto had spoken to her. She did not disclose what she had said, but stated that because of their conversation she decided to go to the rooms of Margaret Breem and try to get inside. The lock was blocked up with bits of rag, so she had to get something to clear it before she could open the door using her key. She said that she did not go inside but stood at the doorway with Mrs. Shafto. The room was in a terrible state, so she had intended to go and find a health inspector to look at it. However, as she was leaving, Mrs. Sloane shouted up, asking her if that was Margaret's room. She said she told her yes, and Mrs. Sloane asked if she could come and look at it. She said she then entered the room with Mrs. Sloane, and they both noticed 2 white sheets or cloths on the bed. She said she was going to remove them, but Mrs. Sloane said she would do it. And on removing the first one, Mrs. Sloane had said, "God bless us all, here is poor little Bobby." Sarah said she removed the other chute and found the body of little Annie Breem. She said it was obvious that both had been there for several weeks. After this, she said she ran outside to look for a policeman, and P.C. Scott came to the house a few moments later. Dr. Page said he had been called to the house in Pandon to examine the bodies of the 2 children. However, he said the house was filthy and he would not be able to do it there, and the bodies would need to be removed to the dead house. He said it was his opinion that both children had been dead for between 3 and 4 months. It was then decided that the inquest should be adjourned to allow time for the postmortems to take place. The inquest resumed in May of 1876 at the police courts in Newcastle. It was noted that since her arrest, Margaret had fallen into despair and appeared to be suffering from some unknown, at the time, illness, and she was frequently asking for water to drink. Because of this illness, she was not present at the reopening of the inquest. And it was also stated that investigations had taken place in North Shields among the friends of Margaret, and it was stated that at no time at all had she taken either of her children to family in that area. The coroner said he could not understand why she had told people that she had taken her children to family, when not only was this not true, but that she must have known that her children were already dead. He felt the only explanation could be that she hoped this would stop neighbours from finding out what she had done. P.C. Gray said he made inquiries as to the whereabouts of Robert Breem Sr. It was known that he had recently been released from prison, and he had been previously spoken to about his children, but P.C. Gray said there was currently no trace of him. He had been working at Gateshead, however he had left both his job and his lodgings in the past 2 weeks. But it was not thought that he would have had any evidence in regard to his children's deaths. Superintendent Duns said he had seen Robert Breem Sr. in April after the adjourned inquest, and he had told him he would need to attend the inquest at the police courts when it reopened. However, as he could not be traced, he was not present. It sounds to me that he had no intention of being involved in the inquest, and did not seem to have any interest in his children's deaths, and he perhaps left the area for fear that he would be expected to cover the cost of their funerals. Mrs. Cash said she lived in Pandon near to Margaret Breem. She said she had seen her at the end of February near to the door of her room. Margaret, she said, had unlocked the door to her room, but Mrs. Cash said she had not gone inside while she was speaking to her. Margaret had told her she had just returned home from North Shields. Mrs. Cash assumed to visit the children. She said she did not see her again after this. Elizabeth Forrest said she had been visiting an aunt in Pandon around 2 weeks before the children's bodies had been found. She said she had seen Margaret and thought she was about to enter her room. She said she had simply passed the time of day with her and went on her way, and she did not see her again after this. Previously, she said she had seen Margaret around Christmas time, and she had told her then that she had sent her young son to live with family at North Shields. She said she did know that Margaret had 2 children, but she did not know their names. Mention was then made that until around a year ago, Margaret's father had lived with her in Pandon. It was never explained why he had moved out of the home, and it seems he was not called to give evidence at the inquest. Sarah Sloane did not give evidence in connection to what she had seen in the room of Margaret Breem on the afternoon when the children had been found. However, she did speak to say that on many occasions she had given bread and other food to Margaret when she had had none. She said she hoped this would help to feed the children. And she said she had not seen Annie for around 12 months and she had not seen Robert since September last year. Dr. Page said he had performed the post-mortem examinations on both of the children. He said he had found them to be undernourished and very little food in their stomachs, and he believed that the cause of death for both of the children was a lack of food. He felt that due to the condition of their bodies, Robert had been the first to die. John Patterson said he was an analytical chemist and said he had been called upon to find out if there was any evidence of poison in the bodies of either of the children, and he said that he had found none. The coroner spoke to the jury at the inquest, saying it was for them to decide if the children had lost their lives due to neglect by Margaret Breem, perhaps because of lack of money to feed them, or had she intended to deliberately starve her children to death. The jury retired for a short time, and on their return the foreman spoke of them having reviewed the evidence in minute detail, and it was felt that they could only reach a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against Margaret Breem on account of how her children were starved and kept in such filthy conditions, and that she had clearly known they had died and had kept their bodies hidden. The coroner said he quite agreed with their decision. Margaret Breem, it was said, would be taken to the police courts the following morning to be officially committed for trial. I sadly did not find any evidence of a funeral for either Robert or Annie. A funeral, I feel, is something that would have been fully covered by the papers at the time, due to the fact that this was a case of 2 children that had died, so this leaves me in little doubt that their father never returned to pay for their burials, so sadly it seems the children would have had paupers' funerals, and I sadly found no evidence of a headstone for either of the children. Margaret Breem remained in Newcastle prison in a state of ill health until her death on May the 12th from dropsy, which is known better today as edema and is connected to heart failure, and she was never officially committed for trial for the manslaughter of her 2 children. An inquest was held at Newcastle prison where it was stated that she had been cared for by the prison doctor, Mr. Hardcastle, and the matron, Mrs. Harrison. The Deputy Governor of the prison, Mr. Little, said he had never heard Margaret mention any details of the death of her children, either to admit or to deny her involvement in their deaths. Mrs. Harrison said she had been with Margaret until her death, and she said she had never made any statement about the death of her children. In fact, she said she had barely spoken at all. The jury at the inquest into Margaret's death very quickly returned a verdict of death by natural causes. As with her children before her, I found no details of a funeral for Margaret Breem. However, in this case it is quite possible that her body would have been given over for medical research. However, there is no evidence to 100% suggest that this was the case. And I did not, as expected, find any evidence of a headstone for Margaret anywhere in the area. And I also found no further evidence of Robert Breem Sr. It seems he vanished without a trace after the death of his children. This was one of the most incredibly sad and tragic stories I have covered. There seems to be very little to explain the deaths of the 2 poor children, Robert and Annie, other than the possibility that rather than give her children to family when she could not afford to care for them, Margaret simply allowed them to starve to death. There was never any mention by those who knew her that Margaret was someone who spent all of her money on drink. But perhaps her husband leaving her and later her father also leaving left her without the money to support her family, as evidence was given that she did often need food from friends. But this is absolutely no excuse for her to leave her children to starve and then to lie to those who knew her that they were with family and both well. So it leads me to wonder that did she at some point lose all sense of sanity at the position she found herself in, which left her unable to make the correct choices and to protect her children, or was she simply feeding herself and neglecting the ones who were not able to help themselves? Whatever the reason, two poor defenceless children lost their lives for what seems to be no real reason at all, as they clearly could have been sent to her family in North Shields. But what do you think? Was Margaret just a selfish woman taking care of herself and neglecting her children? Or was she someone who had lost her mind and no longer knew what was right and what was wrong? As it must be noted that edema can sometimes cause delirium. So, at the end of the day, what do you think? Do you think it was wrong that she told people that the children had been moved to North Shields? Do you think that she deliberately starved them? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I'm sorry that I did kind of lose my train of thought in that very last paragraph there, but I hope that you are still able to understand what I was talking about. And I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.